Hey, John Boyd.
Alexandra Horn, how are you, my friend?
I am pretty good. This week, we have Nijay Gupta interviewing Dictionary of Paul and His Letters, 2nd edition contributor, Louise Gosbell.
Yeah, and it's an amazing one. Louise contributed the article on disability and Paul, which is one of the many brand new articles in this 2nd edition of the dictionary. Some topics have been perennial, but there's a lot of new scholarship and new attention on all kinds of things in the last 30 years. So the 2nd edition is getting at topics that are right there in Paul. They're right there in the New Testament, but they're getting fresh attention in this edition.
Yeah, new article to Dictionary of Paul and His Letters, and a late edition. So as you listen in, you'll hear Nijay talk a little bit about how they came to find Louise and add her contribution to the mix kind of late in the game. One thing that I really loved hearing from their conversation is Louise talking about the state she was in the process of writing. She was dealing with some chronic pain and was laid up in bed while writing this article. And it's significant to hear what her experience is. Knowing these details behind the scene, how does that change or transform our understanding of what she's writing on?
Right. It's always fascinating to hear a detail like that. As an editor, I'm privy to a little bit more information sometimes as I'm talking with authors about their first draft, about their revisions. You know, as the reader of a book, you don't necessarily know what someone's, life is like, whether it's a health situation like this or a disability, a family situation, career change, moving across, the globe. And sometimes those things aren't really relevant, so an author doesn't need to talk about it. But lots of times experiences like that really shape an author's point of view, the kind of research they're doing, and their mindset on thinking about it. So it's great to really be behind the scenes here with Professor Gosbell and hearing about her process.
Together, Nijay and Louise are talking about a lot of important topics for not only our here and now of engaging disability in the church and looking at Paul's letters as it relates, but also about the kingdom to come.
Yeah.
We hope that you listen in, enjoy this conversation.
My name is Nijay Gupta. I am one of the co-editors of the Dictionary of Paul and His Letters. Pleased today to talk to our special guest, Dr. Louise Gosbell, who contributed the subject Disability and Paul. How are you today, Louise?
I'm well, Nijay. How are you doing?
Doing pretty well. I'm excited to be talking to you about a topic that's really important to me. Before we get into the subject matter, because I think you have a really interesting story and a passion behind your subject, I do want to just get to know you as a person. This is the first time we have a chance to talk to each other live, even though we've exchanged emails before. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do?
Yes, I live in Sydney, Australia. I'm married to Mark, and we have 3 grown-up-ish daughters, 2 young adults and a teenager. And we have a house full of pets at our house. I am currently the research manager at the Australian College of Theology. Prior to my current role, I was principal at a small theological college here in Sydney. But after a significant period of significant health issues, I ended up having to resign from that position. So the last few years has been an interesting time for me, but I have been really grateful for the opportunity to be able to continue researching and writing when I've been able to do that despite the sickness over the last few years.
Sounds really challenging. I want to get into that part of your story in a little bit, but I'd love to go back, and I'm always interested in the life journey of academics. So take us back to when you were younger. Tell us what the 10-year-old Louise dreamed about doing, maybe what the 18-year-old thought, and then actually how you ended up getting a PhD in biblical studies.
Gosh, what did I want to do when I was 10? I think I wanted to be a writer. Isn't it funny how you think you want to do something and then you venture off into a different pathway and then come back to the same thing? I did want to write. I was always interested in writing, but I think I imagined writing fiction. Perhaps that's what I thought when I was younger. When I was 18, I left high school. I went to university and I was doing a degree in literature and arts, so still sort of along the same pathway. But actually, my mother passed away very unexpectedly when I was 18. I quit my university degree so I could work to help support my family financially. Ended up working at a record store for a few years, so it was a very different life path. But it was during that time, after a really challenging time after my mother passed away, that I actually became a Christian. And that was eventually what led me down the pathway to go to theological college. Don't really know what I was aiming for sort of post-theology, but was really just, I think my life changed so radically after becoming a Christian. That seemed like the natural next step for me to do instead of going back to my arts degree to do a theological degree. So when I got to the end of my degree, I was encouraged to go on to do an honours year here, which is a short thesis. And I can remember thinking, I have no idea what I'm going to write about that 2,000 years of biblical scholars haven't already all covered 1,000 times over. And I wasn't too interested in just trying to write something about one Greek word. I wanted something practical. But anyway, at that time, my mother-in-law called me. And I have a brother-in-law who has Down syndrome, and he had been part of their family. He was adopted as a baby. By this time, he was in his late teens and had been helping out in their local church community, bringing brochures in, welcoming people at the door. But a new minister actually started at the church where my in-laws were attending, and then called my mother-in-law and said, I'm sorry, but your son isn't allowed to help out at church anymore. We don't want him welcoming. We don't want him handing out bulletins. And his rationale was that someone with an intellectual disability shouldn't be allowed to welcome people at the front of church because they don't have the capacity to be able to call themselves a Christian. So that was the first kind of moment for me of thinking theologically about the issue of disability. So I decided that's what I would write about for my honours thesis. And I did think, I'll write this and then move on to something else. And many years later, I've just never really moved on from writing about disability. It has become something that I'm very passionate about and train churches in disability inclusion and write academically on biblical studies and disability. So that was my journey. I think it was not intentionally setting out to be an academic, but I just became so passionate about this area in particular that I wanted to pursue research and writing in this space.
Thanks for sharing that. I know there's a lot of challenging things in there. I'm curious about how you chose a program for a PhD. You did this honors degree and you stayed, sounds like, generally in the same subject. How did you choose a university, a supervisor? What was it like to arrive at a specific topic? And then I'd love for you to share a little bit about what your dissertation was about, because it's definitely within the same subject matter as your work with our dictionary.
So how did that happen? I think for me, there's definitely different options that I could have taken here in Australia, or I could have looked overseas. Probably the local options were better. For me at the time, I had young children. I'm not really sure what I was thinking, starting a PhD with a 3-year-old whose idea was that. Somehow we survived. I think I even managed to remember to feed them most days. So that's success as far as I'm concerned. I was really interested in doing a PhD that really had the Greco-Roman background as a key backdrop to what I was writing. So it became natural for me to explore a PhD in ancient history, which I did through a mainstream university here in Sydney, so Macquarie University, which has an excellent ancient history, early Christianity department. The challenge then was actually, because I knew what I wanted to write about, finding a supervisor who'd be willing to take that on. So I think, some people are keen to do a PhD but don't have a particular topic that they want to pursue, so they're in a different space. For me, I was very keen. I wanted to write about the Gospels and disability. And so some of the responses I had from potential supervisors were, I don't understand what you're talking about. Disability is a 20th century concept. There's nothing about disability in the Gospels. It was really interesting, actually. And so eventually it was coming across Larry Wellborn, who came to be my primary supervisor, who straight away understood what I was trying to do, understood the value of the research and how it could be meaningful beyond the dissertation itself. But just having someone who was willing to be supportive and champion the topic I was wanting to do. I think if you don't have someone who's on board with you and supportive as a supervisor, that would make your journey very, very different. So I was very grateful for his enthusiasm from the outset.
Of course. I love that your topic comes out of a passion. I love that you kind of went into this knowing what you wanted to do. Can you just give us like a snapshot? What is your dissertation about? What is the argument there? Because just like you said, a lot of people reading the Bible today don't automatically connect what's going on in the Gospels to the subject of disability. So give us a sense of what you actually discovered in your research.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think for me, what was important was what I was seeing in church communities, what I still see in church communities, I guess, is the healing stories of Jesus being used in ways that can be very demeaning and exclusive against people with disabilities. So I hear these stories being preached and they're, oh, the man born blind, loathed his disability. The most important thing for him was to have his disability eradicated. And, that's the same for people today. These are the sorts of things I often hear in sermons. So people extrapolate the experiences of people with disability, which are recorded in the Gospels, and they assume that that's still the life experiences of people today. So that was something I found problematic. I also struggled with the fact that there was these broad generalizations about the experiences of people with disability in the Gospels. So the assumption that every person with a disability was marginalized, excluded, begging on the side of the road. And that's because for most of us who are reading the Bible, this is our only context for learning about the experiences of people with disabilities in the ancient world. So we extrapolate that to think, oh, that's what it was like for everyone. So I wanted to get a little bit behind that. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. What was happening in the ancient world? What was life like for people with disability? And it was really helpful to do all of that, to understand, actually, there was people who served in the military. There was people who worked in all sorts of different jobs. There were people who were politicians. So the experiences of people with disability in the ancient world were vastly different from one another, the same way that they are now. But I think what we see in the Gospels are people who were marginalized and excluded because of the severity of their disability or perhaps their family and economic circumstances. And so we're seeing a very particular group of people with disability in the Gospels, those who are actually on the margins. But I think we have to be careful with making the assumption that that's about everyone. So I think what I was trying to do is have a look at some healing passages and ask the question, if we actually foreground the issue of disability, how might we approach this text differently? Or what might some of the insights be that are going to be a little bit different to these stereotyped things I keep hearing about, a connection between faith and disability or sin and disability, these sort of natural connections people seem to want to make and then extrapolate on people today. So I looked at the parable of the banquet, so not a healing story, but tried to take a look at that in a deeper way from a disability perspective. So one of the most interesting things that I looked at, I think, as part of that research was this whole culture in the ancient world of banqueting and all of these really interesting references and artwork that depict people with disability in the ancient world as entertainers at banquets and as servants as banquets, as this really interesting backdrop to the gospel, where I think, how revolutionary is it? How countercultural was it that Jesus said, actually, you need to invite in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame to be fully fledged invitees to the banquet against this backdrop where people with disability were generally only ever the servants or the entertainers. So I think there's something so deep and rich that's there by having a deeper understanding of what was happening in the ancient world. So that's in a nutshell, I think, some of the things that I looked at in the dissertation.
Yeah. Just to whet people's appetite, her dissertation is called The Poor, the Crippled, the Blind, and the Lame, Physical and Sensory Disability in the Gospels of the New Testament, published with Mohr-Siebeck 2018. I will say for listeners who are just going on to Amazon or another bookstore to buy it, these are expensive books. And so maybe try to get it rented from a theological library near you or check out some of her articles that may be available more widely. I'm going to go a little bit off script here, Louise, and just ask, what do we learn from Jesus himself in the incarnation as the Son of Man, the Son of God? Can we learn some things about disability and the theology of disability through the person of Jesus presented in the Gospels, through the death of Jesus, through the resurrection? I don't know if you address all that, but I'm just really curious now we're on this subject. We could talk about characters, we could talk about stories, but did you have any specific engagement with the person of Jesus himself and giving us some new models to think about?
That wasn't part of my dissertation originally, but it is part of something a new book that I'm currently working on, but literally just at the beginning of some of that research and writing and thinking about that. I guess initially I would say I think the incarnation is key, actually. I think we talk about, or we're part of a faith that has this incarnation at its center, which is this very concept of God becoming flesh, becoming human and understanding human experience. You know, for someone who lives with chronic pain and disability myself, I find something very personal and something very encouraging in the message of the incarnation, the reality of the incarnation, and thinking Jesus understood what limitation was. Jesus understood what physical pain was. There's certainly big debates in disability theology about the resurrection of Jesus, the fact that he carried the scars or the marks or the wounds, depending on how you want to translate it.
Yeah.
Of the crucifixion on his resurrected body. So this has been a big discussion in disability theology. How much then are these marks, wounds, kept on our body post-resurrection? So for some people, they would see this as a promise that perhaps disability isn't completely eradicated in the resurrection, in the future kingdom. Perhaps there is a sense in which that part of my disability, which is identity constitutive, is the language Amos Yong would use, central to who I am as a person, will be retained if that's something that is key to who I am. Now, those are big debates that we could talk about for a very long time, but they're challenging for us to think about and helpful for us to think about, just to get beyond some of the stereotypes that exist about thinking about disability in the resurrection, because we're very quick to want to say to people, don't worry, you'll be healed in heaven, almost as a way of dismissing our embodied experiences of disability now. And I think it's helpful to reframe those discussions and give us space to actually recognize the importance of our embodied experiences, whether you have disability or not, whether that's through the process of aging, whatever it might be. So I think there is something really key for us in thinking theologically about the incarnation in relation to the experience of Jesus' limitations, the weaknesses, the hardship, the pain that he experienced in his lifetime.
On that subject, there's a word that you use in your essay, we'll get to your essay in a minute, that I've been studying lately because I've been interested in the work of Mike Parsons and others on the terminology physiognomy. Now, this, you talked about how you're interested in the Greco-Roman backgrounds, context of early Christianity. This is a big deal. Can you explain to listeners, I think there's so much that we can learn and understand from the ancient world around physical appearance and how people analyzed and valued physical appearance. Not all disabilities are physical, I understand that, but can you explain what is physiognomy and how does it help us better understand certain parts of the New Testament?
Mike Parsons' work is fabulous, isn't it? What he's done in terms of, yes, that idea of physiognomy, again, being in the backdrop, that behind something that's influencing some of our New Testament texts. So the idea is it's often referred to as a pseudoscience, the belief that they had in the ancient world that your physical characteristics and your mannerisms were reflective of your deeper character. And so if you were, the stereotype that still exists in like Hollywood pictures, right? This idea that if you're physically ugly on the outside, it's representative of your character on the inside. And so this was a very much an important ideal. And so you were assessed in terms of your physical appearance, the shape of your head, the strength of your ankles, the muscular tone of your body or the shape of your body, as well as the way that you moved. What kind of gait do you have? Do you swing your arms? How do you use the tone of your voice? All of these things were considered to be indicative of the kind of character that you are. And I think there are places throughout the New Testament where we see this at play. And so I do think this is part of the accusations that are leveled at Paul in terms of his, so-called weaknesses. How do you have such a weak body and yet your letters are so strong? This seems deeper than just an offhand comment, but it seems to me like a physiognomic slur against Paul at this point. But I also think we see, as Mike Parsons points out in his work, this as a backdrop to many of our stories in other places in the New Testament. So he talks about Zacchaeus, for example. He writes about the healing in Acts 3 and possible physiognomic imagery behind that as well. So it is, I think, a fundamental idea that we don't necessarily pick up on immediately as we're reading our New Testament texts.
Do you think that scholars have often wondered, I guess my students have asked me, why is Jesus never physically described in the Gospels? Because if you're comparing the Gospels to ancient biographies, it's pretty normal, I think, to give at least a little bit of a physical description of the protagonist or the hero of the story. And Jesus isn't described, but I tend, and you can correct me, I tend to point to Isaiah 53, this notion of he had no beauty or majesty, nothing is an appearance. He's one from whom people turn their faces, despised and rejected. This idea that even though modern movies often portray Jesus as, kind of a movie star, supermodel, male, beautiful hair all the time, even though, he's traveling in dusty places. If we're using, let's say, a Johannine lens and using Isaiah 53, there would be this understanding of a kind of counterintuitive to Greco-Roman physiognomy. Do you have a better explanation, or is it no big deal that Jesus isn't physically described in some of these texts?
I would agree with you, actually. I think that there's probably a very particular reason why that is the case. I think I would point people to Isaiah 53 as well. Obviously, it's not the same as having a physical description of Jesus himself. But the language of Isaiah 53, I think, is very counterintuitive if you're thinking about the experience of physiognomy. If you're thinking about drawing those lines, it describes someone who is not beautiful or symmetrical or something that would draw your attention in a positive way. It has this kind of negative representation. The absence of physical descriptions of Jesus, I think, could probably end up being quite distracting and then end up being, drawing this kind of attention that is not what we're wanting to look for Jesus for. So whether that's positively or negatively in his appearance, I think we're being directed to not actually focus on his appearance, but actually be judging his character on who he is and the way he acts rather than the way he looks.
All right, one more question for the Gospels. I can't help but ask you this, but you can always ask for a pass because we do have to talk about Paul. I'm curious, when Jesus does the healing of the man and it doesn't work the first time and he sees people as trees and then he heals them again. Can you make any sense of that? Because I'm sure if I was asked to preach on it, I would come up with some really bizarre theory. But in your research, do you have a pretty good handle on what's going on there?
Gosh, do you know what? I haven't thought about this passage for a really long time, so I'm not sure I would be able to give you an effective answer at this particular point. I remember all those theories about it sort of paralleling Peter's coming to understand who Jesus is, that it happens partially and then fully. But yeah, from a disability perspective, I've probably not got much to offer you.
Nothing special to say there. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll keep working on that. Let's talk about Paul, just for listeners in terms of how these articles come about. We had kind of gotten to the end of our process with DPL and somebody had just mentioned on social media, hey, you should have an article on this. It hadn't come up in our original set of discussions because it wasn't in the original dictionary. And to be honest, it's not a common topic in Pauline studies, but that's sort of the point of needing an article on this. So as you're looking around, Louise, obviously you're someone well published in this area. But I remember thinking together with the editors, what are you going to talk about in this essay? Because, we don't immediately, other than the thorn in the flesh, and we could talk about that for a minute. Other than the thorn in the flesh, I don't immediately. Then I read your essay. I thought, okay, yes, there is stuff to talk about. And you can use a disability critical lens for anything in the Bible because it's not just about passages where somebody has, a sort of legal or official disability. But tell us why you said yes to writing this article and sort of the process you went through in deciding what to talk about.
It was really an interesting experience. I do remember getting the email. I think it came via Mike Bird. Is this something you'd be interested in? So just a bit of personal background at the time. I was really unwell at the time. I think it was about March of 22. And in January of 22, I had developed a significant heart condition. And so I actually had been in bed since January when I received this email at the time. So I was really unwell. I didn't really leave my house other than medical appointments for about 6 months. So it was an interesting time to get the request, actually. So I was really, really keen to do it, but not sure if I even had the capacity to do it at that time. So I considered it for a little while. I knew the time was ticking because, as you said, it was coming towards the end of the project. So I knew I only had a short period of time to write it if I was going to. And I thought, okay, great, that's fine. I'll just do it. But it was really cathartic for me in some respects, getting this opportunity to write on Paul and weakness and limitation while I was literally lying in my bed. A beautiful friend of mine was the one who went to the library on my behalf and got resources that she sent through to me. So it was a lovely image of interdependence and mutuality at work. We have these visions of scholars in beautiful university libraries or the little offices and so on. But literally, as you read that piece, I was snuggled in my bed with a cat at my side. So you can remember that as you're reading that piece. But it was actually really helpful. I think we often read Paul as this kind of beacon of strength and power and ability and perseverance. And we see him in all of these ways that we associate with strength and ability. And I think there are definitely these references there to him in relation to weakness, in terms of the thorn in the flesh, issues with eyes, whatever it might be. And I think we tend to sort of breeze over those. We breeze past them and we don't spend as much time reflecting on those. But I think for Paul, he really does seem to not eschew those. He's not trying to say, oh, please don't call me weak. Please don't use this language against me as an insult. He seemed to want to embrace that language of limitation and weakness. Why? Ultimately, he tells us at the end of 2 Corinthians, doesn't he? Because God's power is made perfect in human weakness. So he doesn't seem to see this, what I think his Corinthian detractors in particular are trying to use as a slur against him. He takes that on board as part of who he is and embraces that and accepts that limitation. Only God is limitless. So we shouldn't be afraid of our limitations and weakness as human beings. And instead, we want to laud our ideas of power and strength and ability and intelligence. I think we're missing something key in Paul, actually, if we continue to overlook that. And we get this picture then of him being strong and mighty and able, so much so that some scholars, I think, are really shocked at the possibility that you could even say Paul had a chronic illness or disability. Somehow that's incredibly offensive to people. Well, he couldn't have done his missionary journeys if he had a disability. But I would say, well, why not? Why not? For starters, why couldn't he? Yes, it would have been challenging, but I don't think impossible. But I think we need to question ourselves, why is this such a difficult concept for us to embrace? What is so difficult about thinking about Paul potentially having a disability that sits uncomfortably with us, which I think should force us to interrogate our notions of human ability and challenge our ableism, actually, what we think humans are supposed to be able to do and manage. And I think we're importing our 21st century ideas about disability. We think disability requires support workers and mobility aids. In the ancient world, those things weren't as common or didn't exist. So you literally would have just got on with your life. If Paul felt so strongly about the gospel message going out, I don't think a chronic illness or disability would have been a barrier to him going and taking that message out. I really hope that people might be challenged as they read the article to think about Paul from a different way, and instead of just sort of skipping over those references to illness and disability, actually pondering them and what that might mean for us as humans as we contemplate our own experiences of weakness and limitation. For me, it was really encouraging. It was really helpful to be lying there in bed, as people were saying to me things like, oh, you must have a great sense of loss because you can't do your job anymore, or it's a shame that God can't use you the way that he used to. And I was really challenged as someone who writes in disability to remember that, God works through all of us. I don't think God was saying, oh dear, what a shame, we can't use Louise anymore, I'm going to move on to someone else. God still works through us, but perhaps in different ways than what we're expecting. I don't think human weakness or limitation is a barrier to God being at work in and through us. And that was really helpful for me to sit and work through as I was lying in bed writing the article. And I hope that will be as other people encounter the article for themselves in the dictionary too.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I can't imagine, and many of us would just say no to an article under those circumstances, so I'm glad that you said yes. I want to get to one last kind of deeper question, but we got to address the thorn in the flesh because I know that is something people are curious about. You do a good job briefly talking about that in your DPL essay. You were very diplomatic, allowing for various different interpretations, but everybody's got their own take on it. So do you have your own personal preference in terms of what you think is going on with a thorn in the flesh? Or is it one of those things where it's lost to history and we won't know until some great by and by?
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, people do have their different perspectives on what the thorn in the flesh is. So some people do just say it's the insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities that Paul refers to in that same section of 2 Corinthians. But I think given how many times Paul does talk about, especially in Galatians, his experiences of body ailment or weakness or limitation, I wonder whether it is possible he is also referring to some kind of physical disability, some kind of chronic illness that might have plagued him as well. I just don't think we should be so quick to dismiss that possibility. And again, I would want people to interrogate their own assumptions here about why they're so quick to want to say, no, it couldn't possibly be a disability. Why is that actually the case? As you say, ultimately, I don't think we're going to know, perhaps this side of the resurrection, what that is actually going to be. But it is helpful to contemplate the possibility of it being something like a disability or illness, because I think it does help us to think through different issues that are presented in Paul's letters, perhaps that we don't spend as much time looking on. So perhaps it's a combination, all of those things, his situation, his circumstances, but also what's happening in his own body and mind at the same time as well.
Well, if it is bad eyesight, I actually don't think it could be bad eyesight because there are other reasons why he might write with large letters. But I can understand that because I'm at the age now where the font keeps increasing on my phone. And also when I preach, I use a paper manuscript. I'm just old school like that. And I keep increasing the font of the printout of my sermon. I think I'm up to 18-point font now for my preaching, so I totally can identify with that. One last question as we conclude our conversation. I want to go back to Paul's statement, which relates to what we've been talking about, when I am weak, then I am strong, and the relationship between suffering as paideia, or suffering as healthy training, and healing. And so Paul seems to put together two things at the same time. One is the value of suffering, the grace of suffering. And not all disability is suffering, but I have issues with chronic pain. And I know these things can often go hand in hand. So, the idea that suffering is really good for you. Look at Romans chapter 5. That leads to character, leads to testing, leads to a lot of good things. And Paul even says, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And at the same time, valuing healing and valuing looking forward in hope to the resurrection, things like that. Where do we find the theological heart or coherence between some degree of acceptance and value in our suffering and disability, and not the same thing, and at the same time, sort of that hope and the longing for fullness or completion, teleos in Greek? How have you reflected on that theologically and maybe even also personally?
It's a really good question. I think it has to be, we're holding both of those things in tandem at the same time, aren't we? Because not just for ourselves, but for others. And I think this has definitely been part of my own experience where sometimes we brush aside people's experiences. Now, whether that's disability or grief and loss associated with other things in life, we're very quick to say, suffering brings about good things. And perhaps that limits our sense of empathy or wanting to help people, because this is just part of the suffering of this life. And again, let's look forward to the resurrection. Don't let all of the things that you're experiencing in this life be too burdensome for you. They do, help you with perseverance and character and hope. And so I think that can make us perhaps be not as compassionate to others or not be as active as we could be in wanting to support and help people. We dismiss it because we think, suffering is this godly thing that will be of benefit to you. So I think it's about trying to hold those two things together. As you say, not all disability is suffering. And we put ourselves in a difficult situation if we conflate those things. So there'd be many people who would say they don't suffer with their disability. It's just a part of who they are. But for some people, they do live with chronic pain, limitations, frustrations that are part of what it means to live with a disability or chronic health issue. And my experience has been, yes, I feel like I can come to terms with that in myself, but the hardest thing has been other people just feeling, that sense in which people don't know how to respond to someone in that situation. I think that's been the biggest thing that I've had to grapple with. And so wanting to help people to learn how to be compassionate for people's embodied experiences now and in this lifetime, the challenges in this, not quickly rush to God is at work in this, but to sit with people, to hold space with people, understand the challenges. Yes, God might be at work in and through it, but it doesn't take away the reality of that suffering and that hardship. So wanting to journey with people in the midst of that and support them, even as they look forward to, bodies without pain in the future kingdom. So I think that it is that tension of wanting to say, yes, God can work through really hard things, through trials and suffering and hardship in our lifetime. But we are journeying together as the community of God, as the people of God. And so wanting to hold and support each other as we do that, rather than just think, oh, well, if God is using it, you just sit over there and suffer by yourself. Come back to us when you're done. Just making sure we are the people of God, the body of Christ, working together in mutuality and interdependence, ensuring we're still allowing people, not allowing, that's not the right word, but enabling people with disability, chronic health issues to be active participants in our church communities, to help them find and use their gifts in service to God, rather than thinking we have to siphon off or keep away people who are suffering or finding life hard over there. Yeah, so I think it's about holding those things together somehow and being compassionate, as I said, journeying well with people in life.
Well put. Last thing, can you recommend, people are going to hear this if they're like me and they're going to think, I'm going to read the dictionary, but I want to read a book. I want to read something that's going to help me better understand either a theological perspective on disability in the church or something for biblical studies. Can you recommend a book that can be a next step for people who are listening, a call to action to say, hey, you feel challenged by this, you feel hungry to learn more? What would be a good resource that you'd recommend that people check out?
There's some good introductory books. The ones that I generally recommend to people who are sort of brand new into thinking about disability and biblical studies or disability and theology. Baylor University Press has a book which is called The Bible and Disability, which is a commentary. That's useful because there are short articles on different books of the Bible which focus on particular areas where disability is a key part of a text. So that's a good entry level into thinking about disability. If you're interested sort of more broadly in issues of theology, there's a great book by Amos Young. It's a little bit dated now, but it's still really valuable, which I think is called Disability and the People of God, something along those lines, which is fabulous. Brian Brock's book, which is just called Disability. His more user-friendly version of disability is really good. And Lamar Hardwick's book on disability. All of those are fabulous kind of first steps into the world of disability and theology.
Well, thank you. Our time went by so fast. It's been a pleasure talking to you. For those listeners out there, you're interested, check out her dictionary article called Disability and Paul. And if you're really eager, check out her dissertation, but also these wonderful recommendations that we mentioned here at the end. And thanks again for listening to Behind the Books.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Behind the Books from IVP Academic.
Join us next week when Nijay Gupta connects with contributor Dennis Edwards.
Behind the Books is a production of IVP Academic. For more information on any IVP titles mentioned in this episode, visit ivpress.com and use code IVPOD25. That's IVPOD25 for 25% off. Sound engineering by Honest Podcasts. Our producers are Alexandra Horn and Travis Alberton. Our production assistants are Christine Policcio-Mello and Jack Reese. Our hosts are Scott McKnight, Lynn Kohick, Nijay Gupta, John Boyd, and Alexandra Horn. Don't forget to subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and leave a rating and review to support the show.